The silent dawn shook violently as another system failed somewhere deep in its crystal hull, and Captain Zaraka pressed her long fingers against the flickering control panel while her ship limped through the endless darkness of space with sparks flying from damaged circuits and the smell of burning metal filling the air. Around her crew, her people, the Zephyrians, had built this research vessel to explore distant stars and make peaceful contact with new species, but now it served as an escape pod carrying the last survivors from their colony on Titan 7, where the Vakran Empire had struck without warning 3 days ago, with their massive war fleet turning a thriving world of 12 million souls into burning rubble. The communication officer Velm looked up from his station with his crystalline features glowing faintly blue in distress, and spoke in their musical language about how their long-range transmitters were barely functional but still capable of sending one final message across the galaxy before complete power failure. Azaraka knew this might be their species' last chance to call for help, because the Vakrans had already destroyed 43 of their worlds in the past year and showed no mercy to anyone who stood in their path of conquest and expansion across this sector of space. She walked to the command center, where her remaining crew of 18 worked frantically to keep their ship running, while outside the viewports the stars seemed cold and distant, like tiny lights that offered no hope or comfort to those who faced extinction. The captain began recording what might be the final transmission from her people and explained in the common galactic language how the Zephyrian collective needed immediate military assistance from any advanced civilization that might receive this desperate plea for survival. Her words carried across space on emergency frequencies while she described how her peaceful species had tried everything diplomatic to stop the Vakran advance, including offering their advanced scientific knowledge and crystal technology in exchange for peace, but the brutal empire only understood strength and conquest. Meanwhile, in another part of the galaxy, Captain Jake Morrison sat in his command chair aboard the human exploration vessel New Horizon and listened to his communications officer Lisa Chun report an unusual signal coming from the Outer Rim territories, where few civilized species were known to exist. Morrison was a career military officer who had spent 20 years exploring unknown regions of space for Earth Command, and his ship carried a crew of 200 brave souls who volunteered for missions that could last years without contact with home. Lisa played the transmission through the bridge speakers, and everyone fell silent as they heard the alien voice speaking in accented but clear galactic comment about a species facing complete destruction from an aggressive empire that had already claimed dozens of worlds. The message contained star charts showing the location of the damaged alien ship, and Morrison studied the navigation data while his chief engineer, Pete Rodriguez, warned that reaching those coordinates would require a 3-day journey through uncharted space with no guarantee they could help Dr. Amy Brooks, the ship's medical officer, pointed out that first contact protocols required approval from Earth Command before approaching unknown alien species, but Morrison had already made his decision and ordered course change toward the distress signal. The New Horizon turned away from its original mission and jumped to hyperspace, while Morrison sent a priority message back to Earth explaining his actions and requesting immediate backup for what might become a complex diplomatic situation. 3 days later, they dropped out of hyperspace near a strange, crystalline ship that looked nothing like any human design, with elegant curves and translucent sections that glowed with internal light but showed clear signs of battle damage and system failures. Morrison opened communications and spoke carefully in Galactic Common while introducing himself as a representative of humanity and offering assistance to any beings in distress aboard the alien vessel. The response came quickly as Captain Zaraka appeared on their main screen, and Morrison found himself looking at a 7-foot-tall being with crystal-like skin that shifted colors and large eyes that seemed to hold great intelligence and sadness. She explained that her ship carried survivors from a destroyed colony and that her people desperately needed help against an enemy that had superior numbers and showed no mercy to peaceful civilizations. Morrison listened as she described the Vakran Empire and their systematic conquest of Zephyrian space, while his crew worked to understand the scope of the threat facing these graceful aliens, who clearly had never developed serious military capabilities. The Human captain made an immediate decision to render aid and ordered his engineering teams to begin emergency repairs on the alien ship while he gathered more information about the enemy they faced as human engineers worked alongside Zephyrian technicians. Morrison learned that these beings had been peaceful for over 1,000 years and possessed incredible scientific knowledge but lacked any real understanding of warfare or military strategy. Zaraka explained that her people had hoped to find perhaps a small group of experienced warriors who could teach them basic defense tactics and help them organize some kind of resistance against the advancing Vakran forces. Morrison nodded thoughtfully while he composed another message to Earth. Command, because he understood that this situation required far more than a simple rescue mission and that humanity might need to make choices that would affect the balance of power across this entire region of the galaxy. The New Horizon completed repairs on the Silent Dawn, and Morrison promised that help would come while privately wondering if his species was ready for the kind of commitment that might be necessary to save an entire civilization from extinction. Admiral Susan Hayes stood in the command center of Luna, stationed 3 days after receiving Captain Morrison's detailed report about the Zephyrian situation and studied the holographic display showing Vokran Empire territory like a dark stain across the outer rim while her senior staff gathered around the tactical table. Intelligence data painted a grim picture of an aggressive species that had conquered 17 different civilizations in the past 50 years, using overwhelming force and brutal tactics against beings who had never developed serious military capabilities. Commander Rick Taylor finished his briefing about the Krem military strength and estimated they possessed over 4,000 warships with crews trained from birth for conquest and expansion across any territory they considered valuable or strategically important. Hayes listened to the analysis while her mind processed the implications of this threat because the Vakran advance had been moving steadily toward areas of space that could eventually bring them into contact with human colonies. General Alex Carter spread additional star charts across the conference table and pointed out that the Zephyrian collective controlled key hyperspace routes that would give the Vakrans easy access to 3 major shipping lanes used by human merchant vessels. The room fell silent as everyone realized that helping the Zephyrians was not just about saving an alien species but also about preventing a dangerous enemy from gaining strategic advantages that could threaten human space in the coming decades. Hayes made her decision quickly because she had spent 30 years in military service and understood that some threats needed to be stopped before they became unstoppable, and this Vakran Empire clearly fell into that category. She activated the emergency authorization codes and declared Operation Galactic Shield to be the largest military deployment in human history, with orders to mobilize the entire Third Fleet for immediate deployment to Zephyrian space. The scale of the operation shocked even her experienced officers because Hayes was proposing to send 847 warships, including 12 massive carriers, 43 destroyers, and 6 dreadnoughts that represented the most advanced military technology humanity had ever produced. More importantly, the deployment would include 2.3 million human soldiers, Marines, pilots, engineers, and support personnel, along with enough supplies and equipment to sustain a major campaign across multiple star systems. General Carter questioned whether such a massive response was necessary when the Zephyrians had only requested basic military advisors, but Hayes explained that half measures against an aggressive empire would only delay the inevitable conflict. The authorization went through channels quickly because Earth Command had learned from previous conflicts that early intervention with overwhelming force was more effective than gradual escalation that gave enemies time to adapt and strengthen their positions. Captain Morrison received orders to return immediately to Zephyrian space with news of the human response while the Third Fleet began mobilization procedures that would take 6 weeks to complete. Meanwhile, across human territory, the largest military build-up since the colonial wars began as factory worlds shifted to wartime production and training facilities expanded to handle the massive influx of volunteers who wanted to serve. News of the alien threat spread through human colonies and triggered an unexpected response as millions of citizens volunteered for military service even though they had never seen a Zephyrian or heard of the Vakran Empire before. The volunteers came from every human world and included farmers from agricultural colonies, engineers from industrial planets, and scientists from research stations who all shared the common belief that peaceful beings deserved protection from aggressive empires. Morrison returned to the Silent Dawn, where Captain Zaraka waited anxiously for news about whether humanity would provide the small advisory force her people desperately needed to organize some kind of defense. The human captain struggled to find words that would properly explain the scale of his species' response, because he knew that Zaraka expected perhaps a few hundred military instructors at most. When he finally delivered the news about Operation Galactic Shield and the deployment of nearly 1 million human warriors, Zaraka stared at him in stunned silence while her crystalline skin shifted through multiple colors, indicating extreme emotional distress. The Zephyrian captain asked Morrison to repeat the numbers because she could not understand how any species would commit such enormous resources to help strangers they had never met before. Morrison explained that humanity had a long tradition of helping those who could not help themselves, and that his people believed strongly in protecting peaceful civilizations from aggressive empires, regardless of the cost. The news traveled quickly to the Zephyrian High Council on Crystallis Prime, where Elder Torna expressed concern that humans might be another conquering species disguised as helpers, while Elder Simca argued that their actions showed genuine compassion. Debate continued for hours as Zephyrian leaders tried to understand human motivations, because in their experience no species would sacrifice so much for others without expecting significant compensation in return. Elder Limka pointed out that humans had immediately responded to their distress call and performed emergency repairs without asking for payment or territorial concessions, which suggested their intentions were honorable. The council eventually agreed to accept human assistance but established monitoring protocols to ensure that their helpers did not become their new masters, as had happened to other species throughout galactic history. Back on Luna Station, Admiral Hayes supervised the final preparations for the largest fleet deployment in human history, while her staff coordinated logistics for an operation that would strain every resource humanity possessed. The Third Fleet consisted of vessels from every human world, including the flagship Terra's Resolve, which would carry Hayes herself into battle against an enemy that had never faced serious resistance from their victim supply ships loaded with everything from ammunition to medical supplies, while transport vessels prepared to carry ground forces capable of liberating entire planets from Vakran occupation. 6 weeks after Morrison's first contact with the Zephyrians, the human fleet completed its preparations and jumped to hyperspace, carrying enough firepower to change the balance of power across multiple sectors of the galaxy. The Zephyrians had asked for help, and humanity was about to deliver far more than anyone had imagined possible, because sometimes the right thing to do required everything a species could give. The Vakran siege fleet surrounded Crystallis Prime like a pack of metal predators waiting to devour their prey, while Warlord Graktul stood on the bridge of his command ship, watching the beautiful blue and silver planet that would soon belong to the Empire. His force of 400 vessels had spent 3 months systematically destroying the orbital defense platforms and mining stations that protected the Zephyrian homeworld, while preventing any supply ships from reaching the billions of civilians trapped on the surface below. The Warlord expected this final assault to be simple, because the Zephyrians had already proven they possessed no real military capabilities, and their few remaining ships posed no threat to his experienced warrior. Graktul was reviewing attack plans when his sensor officer reported massive hyperspace signatures approaching from the outer system, but the readings showed far more ships than any Zephyrian rescue fleet could possibly contain. The Vakran commander assumed that reinforcements from other battle groups had arrived early to participate in the glorious conquest of the species that had dared to resist the Empire for so long. Instead, 847 human warships dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation and positioned themselves between the Vakran siege fleet and the helpless planet they had been preparing to destroy. Admiral Hayes stood on the bridge of Terra's Resolve and studied the tactical display, showing Vakram positions while her fleet commanders reported ready status from every vessel in Task Force Liberty. The human formation spread across space in a defensive pattern that demonstrated centuries of tactical experience and military doctrine, while Zephyrian civilians on the planet below watched through telescopes and orbital cameras. Hayes opened communication channels to both fleets simultaneously and delivered a message that would be remembered throughout galactic history for its simple clarity and absolute determination. She identified herself as commander of the Human Legion and informed the Vakran forces that they would cease all hostile actions immediately and withdraw from Zephyrian space or face the consequences of their continued aggression. The admiral then addressed the Zephyrians directly and assured them that humanity had come to provide the assistance they had requested, along with enough additional support to ensure their long-term security. Warlord Graktul responded predictably with threats and demands that the unknown species withdraw immediately before his superior force destroyed them completely. Because the Vokran Empire had never encountered serious resistance, the human admiral gave the Vokran commander exactly 10 minutes to begin withdrawal procedures. While her fleet maintained defensive positions and prepared for combat, Operations Graktul used those 10 minutes to study his enemy and concluded that these newcomers might possess advanced technology but lacked the numbers necessary to challenge his experienced fleet. The first engagement began when Vokran heavy cruisers opened fire on the human formation and ended 17 minutes later when the last Vokran vessel either fled the system or drifted in space as a burning wreck. Human tactical doctrine proved devastatingly effective against Vokran strategies because centuries of warfare among themselves had taught humanity to expect and counter every possible approach to space. Combat Captain Steve Murphy led Fighter Squadron Delta in the opening attack and recorded the first confirmed kill when his advanced fighter destroyed a Vokran escort vessel using coordinated missile strikes. The human pilots demonstrated abilities that shocked their enemies because they could adapt to changing tactical situations faster than Vokran commanders could issue new orders to their formations. Advanced human AI systems coordinated simultaneous attacks across multiple vectors, while maintaining perfect communication between all vessels, regardless of jamming attempts or electronic interference. Lieutenant Commander Paul Davis commanded the destroyer, Relentless, and engaged 6 Vokran cruisers simultaneously using tactics that would have been impossible for any other species to execute effectively. The battle developed into a series of smaller engagements as human squadron leaders exploited weaknesses in Vokran formations while maintaining overall fleet coherence. Under Admiral Hayes' command, Vokran warriors had conquered 17 species, using straightforward tactics based on superior numbers and overwhelming firepower, but they had never faced enemies who could think creatively under pressure. The human advantage became obvious when Captain Janet Ross led her task group in a flanking maneuver that destroyed the Vokran command structure while their attention was focused on the main fleet. Warlord Graktul watched his supposedly invincible siege fleet disintegrate under human attacks and finally ordered a general retreat. When his own flagship came under direct assault from 3 human destroyers, the surviving Vokran vessels fled toward their home territory while broadcasting warnings about the dangerous new species that had appeared to protect the Zephyrians. Not a single human ship was lost during the engagement, though several vessels sustained damage that repair crews immediately began fixing using mobile shipyard technology. The complete victory sent shockwaves through both the Vokran Empire and the broader galactic community because no one had expected such a decisive result from the first major battle on Crystallis Prime. Millions of Zephyrians watched the orbital displays and witnessed something they had thought impossible as their oppressors fled in complete disorder. Captain Zaraka stood in the observation deck of her repaired ship and tried to understand how the small advisory force she had requested had become a massive fleet capable of defeating the Vokran Empire. The Zephyrian High Council convened an emergency session to discuss this dramatic turn of events while their people celebrated in the streets for the first time in months. Elder Simca addressed the council about how humanity had delivered far more than anyone had dared to hope while demonstrating that peaceful species could receive protection from aggressive empires. Admiral Hayes received damage reports from her fleet commanders and began planning the next phase of operations because driving off one Vakran siege fleet was only the beginning of a much larger campaign. The Human Legion had proven its effectiveness in the first battle, but everyone understood that the Vakran Empire would respond with greater force and more experienced commanders. Hayes opened communications with Zephyrian leaders and explained that her forces were prepared to liberate every world the Vakrans had conquered while establishing permanent security. For peaceful civilizations, the Zephyrians had asked for help and received a legion, but now they began to understand that humanity was offering something even more valuable than military protection. The humans were proposing to change the fundamental balance of power in this region of space and ensure that aggressive empires could never again threaten peaceful species with impunity. News of the Vakran defeat at Crystallis Prime spread across the galaxy faster than hyperspace communications could carry it, as dozens of species learned that the seemingly invincible empire had met its match in a previously unknown race called humanity. General Carter established forward operating bases on 6 liberated Zephyrian worlds, and each installation became a demonstration of human organizational capabilities that impressed even the scientifically advanced Zephyrians who had thought no species could surpass their efficiency. The logistics networks that supplied the Human Legion across vast interstellar distances operated with precision that kept every soldier fed, equipped, and ready for combat, while mobile repair facilities maintained the fleet at peak operational capacity. Colonel Maria Santos led the 3rd Regiment in the liberation of Kepler Station, where 200,000 Zephyrian civilians had been enslaved in mining operations under brutal Vakran supervision that treated sentient beings like disposable equipment. Her forces stormed the orbital facility using assault techniques that overwhelmed the Vakran defenders before they could organize any coherent resistance or threaten the civilian population. They held hostage. The rescued Zephyrians watched in amazement as human soldiers immediately shared their emergency rations and medical supplies with aliens they had never met while expecting nothing in return. Lena Kor was among the freed scientists, and she began studying human behavior because she could not understand how any species could demonstrate such consistent compassion towards strangers during the chaos of active warfare. The human war machine proved to be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen because it combined devastating military efficiency with genuine concern for civilian casualties and refugee welfare. Lieutenant Colonel Dan White commanded engineering units that constructed mobile shipyards capable of repairing battle damage in days rather than the months such work normally required using conventional methods. His teams worked alongside Zephyrian technicians and shared advanced manufacturing techniques that could revolutionize industrial production across multiple worlds. Once the current conflict ended, Major Julie Kim led reconnaissance units equipped with stealth technology that made them virtually invisible to Vakran senses while they gathered intelligence about enemy positions and defensive capabilities. Her reports provided tactical commanders with detailed information about Vakran strongholds and allowed human forces to plan surgical strikes that minimized collateral damage to occupied territories. The war escalated as humanity deployed weapons and strategies that demonstrated centuries of military evolution because humans had spent so much time fighting each other. They understood warfare better than any peaceful species. Captain Roy Johnson commanded the destroyer Vigilant, and his crew developed new tactics during each engagement while adapting to enemy responses faster than Vakran commanders could counter their innovations. The Vakran Empire found itself facing an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move while maintaining supply lines across distances that should have been impossible to defend effectively. Warlord Graktul submitted reports to the Vakran High Command, describing humans as warriors born from nightmare because they combined tactical brilliance with strategic depth that surpassed anything in Imperial experience. The Vakran leadership authorized the deployment of additional fleets, but their commanders discovered that human forces had already established defensive positions on every liberated world. Colonel Jim Parker led the defense of New Harmony, where his regiment of 5,000 soldiers held off 3 Vakran divisions using prepared positions and coordinated artillery support that turned the planet into a killing field, the Zephyrians observed these battles and began to understand that humanity possessed not just superior technology but a fundamental understanding of warfare that came from millennia of constant conflict. Lena Core continued her behavioral studies and discovered that human soldiers at every level from privates to generals demonstrated absolute commitment to their mission, regardless of personal risk or hardship. She documented how human military psychology differed from every other known species because they seemed to fight not for conquest or resources, but for abstract concepts like justice and freedom. The human approach to warfare confused Vakran strategists who had built their empire on the assumption that all species fought primarily for territorial gain or material advantage. Admiral Hayes coordinated fleet operations from Terra's Resolve, while her forces liberated 43 worlds in 8 months and pushed Vakran armies back to their original borders. Each victory demonstrated human tactical superiority but also revealed something more important about their character because they treated conquered enemies with dignity and respect. Vakran prisoners reported that human captors provided medical care and adequate food while explaining the rules of warfare that protected civilians and non-combatants from military action. The contrast between human and Vakran approaches to conquest became obvious to every species watching the conflict because the humans seemed more interested in liberation than domination. Commander Beth Taylor led special operations teams that infiltrated Vakran installations and rescued prisoners without causing unnecessary casualties among enemy personnel who surrendered willingly. Her success rate remained perfect across dozens of missions because human special forces combined advanced technology with psychological warfare that convinced enemies resistance was futile. The Zephyrian Collective began forming their own military units under human instruction as young civilians volunteered to defend their worlds against future aggression. Elder Remta established the Zephyrian Military Academy with human officers serving as instructors who taught defensive tactics and strategic planning to students who had never imagined fighting a war. The transformation of Zephyrian society accelerated as they learned that peaceful species could maintain their values while developing the capability to protect themselves from aggressive neighbors. Human engineers shared defensive technologies and manufacturing techniques that would allow Zephyrians to build their own weapons and starships once they gained sufficient experience. The war that had begun with desperate pleas for help evolved into something far more significant as humanity demonstrated that advanced civilizations had an obligation to protect those who could not protect themselves. The Vakran Empire faced complete strategic defeat as their military philosophy proved inadequate against enemies who understood that true strength came from fighting for others rather than for themselves. The Vakran High Command gathered in their fortress on Grimhold to address the military disaster that had befallen their empire. As report after report detailed the systematic destruction of their conquest fleets by the mysterious human Legion Supreme, Warlord Vexka stood before the War Council and announced that the Empire would commit every available vessel to one final offensive that would either destroy the human threat or determine the fate of Vakran civilization. His plan involved assembling 2,000 warships from across the Empire, including vessels recalled from distant territories and reserve fleets that had been held back for defending the homeworld itself. The massive armada represented every military asset the Vakrans possessed, and included their most experienced commanders along with elite units that had never tasted defeat in over a century of continuous warfare. Intelligence reports suggested that human forces numbered less than 1,000 ships, which meant the Vakrans would possess overwhelming numerical superiority in the decisive battle. Supreme Warlord Vexka would personally lead this final assault because Vulcan tradition demanded that their supreme commander face the enemy directly when the fate of the Empire hung in the balance. Meanwhile, Admiral Hayes received detailed reconnaissance reports about the enormous Vakran fleet assembling near the border between human-occupied territory and the remaining Vakran strongholds. Her intelligence officers estimated that the enemy force contained more than twice as many vessels as Task Force Liberty, but she had learned not to underestimate human tactical advantages instead of retreating to defensive positions among the liberated worlds Hayes made. A characteristically human decision that surprised both her own officers and Zephyrian observers. She ordered the entire human fleet to advance and meet the Vokran armada in open space where both forces would have room to maneuver without endangering civilian populations on nearby planets. The decision demonstrated the confidence that came from 8 months of continuous victories, but also reflected human military doctrine that favored decisive action over prolonged defensive campaigns. Captain Morrison, now serving as Hayes' tactical advisor, supported the aggressive approach because human forces had proven their superiority in every previous engagement regardless of enemy numbers. The two fleets approached each other across the nebular Gates region where ancient stellar phenomena created a battlefield unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Massive gas clouds and electromagnetic storms provided natural obstacles that would test the maneuvering capabilities of both forces, while creating opportunities for tactical innovation. Admiral Hayes positioned her forces to take advantage of the nebular terrain, while Vexka relied on traditional Vokran tactics that emphasized concentrated firepower and straightforward assault patterns. The Battle of the Nebular Gates began when advanced scouts from both fleets encountered each other near the outer edge of the phenomenon and quickly escalated into the largest space engagement in galactic history. Human tactical doctrine proved its worth immediately as squadron commanders used the nebular environment to mask their movements while coordinating attacks across multiple vectors. Captain Steve Murphy led his fighter wing through a series of lightning strikes that crippled 6 Vokran cruisers before their commanders understood what was happening. The human advantage became obvious when Captain Janet Ross coordinated her task group with 3 other formations to execute a complex flanking maneuver that split the Vokran Fleet. Supreme Warlord Vexka found himself fighting an enemy that seemed to anticipate his every move while maintaining perfect coordination despite the communications interference from the nebular storms. The turning point came when Commander Beth Taylor led her Special Forces team in a desperate boarding action against the Vokran command ship using stealth shuttles that penetrated enemy defenses. Her team of 30 specialists infiltrated the massive battleship and fought their way through corridors filled with surprised Vokran warriors who had never experienced combat aboard their own vessels. The psychological impact of capturing Supreme Warlord Vexka proved devastating to Vokran morale because their entire military philosophy centered on strength and absolute dominance. When news of their Supreme Commander's capture spread through the Vokran fleet, the effect was immediate and catastrophic as unit after unit began withdrawing from the battle. The human victory at Nebular Gates marked the end of Vokran military power because they had committed everything to this final offensive and lost not just ships but their will to continue fighting. Admiral Hayes accepted the surrender of remaining Vokran forces while her medical teams provided aid to enemy wounded and her engineers began rescue operations for damaged vessels. The magnanimous treatment of defeated enemies further demonstrated human character because they showed mercy to those who had shown none to their victims. Back on Crystalis Prime, the Zephyrian population celebrated their liberation while their leaders struggled to understand the scope of what humanity had accomplished. Dr. Lena Kaur completed her study of human military psychology and concluded that these beings represented something unprecedented in galactic evolution. Her research revealed that humans became stronger through adversity and more capable when fighting for others rather than for themselves. The Zephyrian High Council voted unanimously to establish permanent alliance with humanity. While beginning the process of transforming their own society, Elder Simca announced the formation of Zephyrian defense forces that would work alongside human instructors to ensure their species never again faced extinction. Young Zephyrians volunteered in unprecedented numbers for military service because they had learned that peaceful beings must be prepared to defend their values. The war that began with a desperate distress call had transformed both species as Zephyrians discovered their own courage while humans found their place as protectors of galactic peace. Supreme Warlord Vexka sat in his comfortable cell aboard Terra's Resolve and tried to understand how his invincible empire had been defeated by beings who fought for abstract principles. He told Admiral Hayes that Vokrans had never encountered a species that would sacrifice so much for strangers and that human motivations remained incomprehensible to Imperial thinking. The legacy of the Nebular Gate's victory would reshape galactic politics for centuries as dozens of species learned that aggressive empires could be stopped by those willing to stand for justice. The formal surrender ceremony took place 2 years after Captain Morrison first heard the Zephyrian distress call, and Admiral Hayes stood on the Bridge of Terra's resolve while representatives from dozens of liberated species gathered to witness the end of Vokran expansion. Supreme Warlord Vexka signed the surrender documents that officially dissolved the Vokran Empire and established new borders that would be enforced by the newly formed Galactic Defense Alliance. The former Supreme Commander had spent months in captivity studying human behavior and finally understood that his species had encountered something completely outside their experience. He spoke privately with Admiral Hayes before his transport to trial proceedings and admitted that Vokrans had never comprehended the concept of fighting for others rather than for personal gain, the idea that any species would cross interstellar distances to help strangers without expecting territorial concessions or tribute payments remained incomprehensible to Vokran psychology. Hayes listened to his confession with the same patience she had shown throughout the conflict because human military doctrine emphasized understanding enemies rather than simply defeating them. The human legion began its gradual withdrawal from Zephyrian space, but the relationship between the two species had been permanently transformed by shared struggle and mutual respect. Captain Morrison received promotion to Admiral and accepted appointment as human ambassador to the Zephyrian Collective while maintaining oversight of ongoing military cooperation programs. The Zephyrians offered humanity full access to their advanced scientific achievements, including crystal technology and theoretical physics, research that could revolutionize human civilization. More importantly, they provided something equally valuable in the form of a galactic perspective that helped humans understand their role in the broader community of intelligent species. Dr. Lena Kaur published her comprehensive study of human military psychology, and her work became required reading at military academies across 47 different worlds. Her research concluded that humanity represented a unique evolutionary development because they had learned to channel their aggressive instincts into protection of others rather than conquest. The galactic community struggled to understand how any species could develop such advanced military capabilities while maintaining ethical standards that protected even their enemies. Elder Remta opened the Zephyrian Military Academy with human instructors teaching defensive tactics to students who had never imagined they would need to learn warfare. The curriculum emphasized that military strength should serve justice rather than personal ambition, and that true victory came from protecting the innocent rather than dominating the weak. Young Zephyrians proved to be excellent students because their natural intelligence combined with human military knowledge created formidable defenders of peaceful civilization. The transformation of Zephyrian society accelerated as they learned to balance their scientific pursuits with practical defense capabilities that would deter future aggression. Meanwhile, the Galactic Defense Alliance grew from its founding partnership between Earth and Crystals Prime to include 47 member species within 5 years each. New member brought unique capabilities to the alliance while accepting the fundamental principle that advanced civilizations had obligations to protect those who could not protect themselves. The alliance military combined human tactical doctrine with technologies from dozens of species to create defense forces capable of maintaining peace across multiple sectors. Admiral Hayes transitioned from combat commander to alliance coordinator and spent her remaining years establishing the institutions that would preserve galactic stability. The monument erected on Crystallis Prime bore inscriptions in dozens of languages, but the message remained the same in every translation about how humanity had responded to a call for help. The ceremony dedicating the memorial drew representatives from every species that had benefited from human intervention during the war against Vokran expansion. Captain Jake Morrison stood before the gathered crowd and reflected on how much both humanity and the galaxy had changed since that first desperate transmission from the Silent Dawn. His speech emphasized that the true victory had not been military but moral, because the conflict had proven that peaceful species could receive protection from those willing to sacrifice for justice. The Zephyrians had discovered their own courage and strength, while humans had found their purpose as guardians of galactic civilization. Dr. Lena Core presented her final research conclusions to the Assembly and explained how human psychology had evolved to support others rather than dominate them. Her work suggested that humanity's history of constant warfare had taught them to value cooperation over conquest, and to find meaning through service rather than personal advancement. The study became the foundation for understanding how aggressive instincts could be channeled into positive purposes when guided by ethical principles and genuine compassion. Supreme Warlord Vexka served his sentence on a rehabilitation world where former Vakran leaders learned alternative approaches to leadership that emphasized protection rather than domination. Some former Imperial officers proved capable of transformation while others remained trapped by their previous conditioning, but all contributed to understanding how aggressive civilizations could change. The rehabilitation programs became models for post-conflict reconstruction that helped former enemies integrate into peaceful galactic society. Admiral Morrison concluded his diplomatic career by establishing the principles that would guide human foreign policy for generations as they accepted responsibility for galactic security. The human approach to interstellar relations emphasized partnership rather than dominance and mutual benefit rather than exploitation of weaker species. The legacy of Operation Galactic Shield extended far beyond the military victory because it had demonstrated that strength could serve wisdom and power could protect rather than oppress. The galaxy entered a new era where aggressive empires faced organized resistance from species that understood their obligation to defend peaceful civilization. The Zephyrian distress call had been answered with a legion, but the result had been something far more valuable than military victory. Humanity had proven that advanced civilizations could choose justice over conquest, and that the strongest warriors were those who fought for others rather than for themselves.